Near Krinkelt, Belgium, December 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. For Feldwebel Klaus Müller of the 9th Panzer Division, the world was a black forest of snow and shadow. The pre-dawn of December 16th was suffocatingly quiet. A cold so deep it cracked the trees had settled over the Ardennes. This wasn't a weather front. It was the absolute silence of a gigantic, desperate lie about to be shouted into the faces of the Western Allies. Müller was a communications expert, a man who saw the war not in heroic charges, but in the lines of a map and the logistics of a supply chain. At 35, a veteran of both France and the bitter, grinding retreat from the east, he knew desperation when he felt it. The name of the operation was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a nostalgic nod to a defiant German anthem. The objective was anything but defensive, a massive surprise counter-offensive through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied lines and seizing the port of Antwerp. In the minds of Hitler and the High Command, this was the war's final masterstroke. An ideological gamble meant to force a favorable peace before the Soviet steamroller crushed the Reich from the east. But Müller, huddled in a command truck watching the advance logs, knew the chilling arithmetic. Every German soldier fighting in the west was a man not fighting in the east. Every liter of fuel was a tank that might sit idle in Berlin in the coming months. Müller had been at Stalingrad. He had seen what true Russian winter and American Lend-Lease material could do. He had seen the German logistical spine snap under the weight of a war fought 2,000 miles from the Rhine. The troops around him here in the Ardennes were a stark contrast to the hardened veterans of 1940. Mixed in with the few Panzer veterans were teenagers from the Volksgrenadier divisions, men driven by ideology and sheer terror, but utterly lacking experience. These were not the stormtroopers. They were the scraped bottom of the barrel, given one last chance to believe in the myth of German willpower. Their orders were simple: advance quickly and do not stop. Their supply brief was simpler: capture what you need from the enemy. The entire offensive was predicated on the belief that German columns would be able to capture Allied fuel dumps, especially the massive depots at Liège and Spa, to keep their heavy armor moving. It was the largest single logistical gamble of the entire war. Müller was attached to the vanguard, the spearhead intended to break through. Their maps, covered in grease pencil, showed the route in vivid red, a deep thrust that had to happen fast and now. But the reality was already failing the fantasy. The tanks themselves, the mighty Tigers and Panthers, were a triumph of engineering, complex and fearsome. But their fuel consumption was monstrous. A Tiger II could burn 100 gallons of gasoline just idling. They were magnificent weapons, built for short, decisive campaigns, not a 300-mile sprint across enemy territory in winter. The initial attack was a tactical success. The surprise was total. The American defenders, a few exhausted green divisions, were scattered, but the victory was immediately choked by its own success. The plan called for 3 armies, including thousands of vehicles, to move through a few narrow, icy roads. This bottleneck was a fundamental, unfixable flaw. Müller's column was constantly stopping. The sound of idling engines, the stamping of freezing feet, replaced the noise of battle. His radio crackled with frustrating, repetitive reports. Stau, Stau, traffic jam. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the operational commander, had planned for speed. But the ideological will of the Reich could not change the physics of a narrow Belgian road in deep snow. Every delay was compounded. A single broken-down half-track, a common occurrence in the sub-zero temperatures, could halt a column of 30 Panthers for hours. There were no spare parts to be had. German logistics, dependent on localized workshops and rail transport now under constant Allied bombardment, simply could not support this kind of rapid, high-intensity push. Müller observed the stark difference between German and captured American gear. The German Logistics Corps relied on complex, multi-purpose vehicles, often customized and hand-built. Spare parts were a myth. The American forces, by contrast, ran on the Jeep and the GMC 6x6 truck, simple, mass-produced, and interchangeable. For every complex German armored half-track that broke down and had to be abandoned, the Americans could field a dozen durable, rugged utility vehicles. This wasn't a matter of morale or courage. It was a failure of the national industrial strategy. Germany built beautiful, complicated masterpieces. The Allies built reliable, easily replaceable tools on an incomprehensible scale. The first sign that this was a doomed mission came not from a tank battle, but from the sky. For the first 2 days, the weather, heavy cloud, snow, provided the German columns with a perfect gray shield. But Müller knew that was a temporary, meaningless reprieve. He had been praying for the clouds to hold because he knew what waited above. The Allies had absolute air superiority, a fact the propaganda machine chose to ignore until the very last moment. On December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, the clouds began to thin over Bastogne and Saint-Vith, and the air, which had been empty, suddenly became filled. It started with a lone reconnaissance plane, then 2. Müller instinctively grabbed his helmet. He had served on the Eastern Front. He knew the difference between a skirmish and a full-scale industrial beating. The sound wasn't of battle, but of production. The moment the sun broke, the sky became a vast, blue conveyor belt. Waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, aircraft that Germany no longer had the fuel or pilots to seriously contest, began a systematic, terrifying campaign of interdiction. The Allied planes weren't focused on individual tanks. They were hunting the fuel tankers, the supply trucks, and the artillery that were now locked in those immense traffic jams. The air bombardment was surgical and total, aimed at the logistical nodes. Müller watched a column a kilometer ahead disappear in a series of orange and black fireballs, not from enemy shells, but from their own exploding fuel. This was the most effective counterattack imaginable, waged not by soldiers, but by the American oil fields. A single Allied fuel truck, the M4 high-speed tractor, could hold 2,500 gallons. A single German fuel truck might hold 500. For every gallon of fuel the Germans burned to drive into the Ardennes, the Allies could afford to burn 10 to stop them. The battle for the crossroads town of Bastogne became a brutal microcosm of the entire war. Here, the German offensive was met by the fierce, entrenched defense of the American 101st Airborne Division. German commanders committed everything to reduce this strongpoint, seeing it as the key to freeing up the road network. They threw elite panzer units against the perimeter. It was a test of willpower, German determination to advance versus American refusal to surrender. But even Bastogne was an industrial statement. When the weather cleared, the skies filled with C-47 transport planes dropping wave after wave of essential supplies, ammunition, and plasma to the besieged paratroopers. The Allies could afford to fight a siege and simultaneously resupply it from the air. Germany could barely afford the shells to break it. The sight of these massive, slow-moving Allied transports sailing through the sky with total impunity was a stark reminder that Germany did not own the battlefield or the air above it. Müller, a communications man, knew the numbers for artillery. The German artillery, though often accurate, was constrained by supply. Every shell fired was a shell that had had to be transported on those choked roads. The American response was an unending, overwhelming volume of fire. The famous time-on-target concentration, where dozens of American batteries could coordinate to drop hundreds of shells onto a single target zone simultaneously, was a technological feat Germany simply couldn't match anymore. It wasn't about the size of the gun, it was about the rate of industrial output. For every German battery firing with precision, there were 3 American batteries firing with overwhelming volume. The American method was simply drown the enemy in steel. The argument for the superiority of the German Tiger and Panther tanks was technically true. They had thicker armor and better guns than the American Sherman. This was a point of pride for the German soldier. But Müller saw the strategic dead end of that pride. The German command prioritized complexity and quality over production volume. The Sherman, simpler and easier to maintain, was built for mass production. In the last months of 1944, for every 1 Tiger tank that rolled out of a bomb-damaged German factory, the Allies were stamping out nearly 10 Shermans. The The Tiger was irreplaceable. The Sherman was expendable. The Allied strategy was not to win every tank duel, but to win the war of attrition by burying the superior German armor under a mountain of simpler, brutally effective metal. By December 24th, Müller's unit had stalled completely, just short of the Meuse River. The initial forward momentum had dissolved into a frozen, demoralized static defense. The advance was over, but the myth of the miracle offensive persisted in the radio reports and the propaganda. Müller saw the truth in the faces of the young soldiers, teenagers really, who were now scavenging for food in Belgian farmhouses. Morale collapsed not from a lack of bravery, but from the simple, terrifying realization that they couldn't move. Their magnificent tanks, Panthers, Tigers, were now just static pillboxes, their barrels silent, their fuel gauges empty. Müller felt a profound spiritual despair wash over him. He realized that they were about to die, not because they were outfought by superior tactics, but because they were fighting an industrial continent. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof. Ideology could not stop a bomber. Willpower could not move a tank without fuel. He and his men were good soldiers, but they were participants in a contest that was already over. They were a finely crafted sword, facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome was never in doubt. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Allies called it, was the last time the German army would mount a major offensive in the West. It failed not because of a single tactical mistake, but because of a failure of industrial accounting. The Americans alone would replace their tank losses in the battle, around 800, in just a few weeks. The German tank losses, over 600, were, for all intents and purposes, permanent. There was no industrial mechanism left to replace them. The German reserve of fuel, men, and materiel was utterly exhausted in the icy fields of the Ardennes. This single, desperate throw of the dice paved the way for the total collapse of the Reich in the spring of 1945. For Feldwebel Müller, trapped in a snow-covered traffic jam, the moment of revelation wasn't a heroic stand. It was the simple sight of an endless stream of American supply trucks, hundreds of them, moving with total impunity, proving that the enemy was fighting a logistics war, not a war of willpower. He looked at his map, at the bold red line of the planned advance that ended miles short of its goal. He didn't see a defensive line. He saw the end of the road. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse, culminating in the battle for Berlin. But for the men on the Ardennes, the end came in a single horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw the sky black with enemy planes, the roads choked by their own vehicles, and a force that was not just an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer peering through the frozen windscreen of a stalled truck, it was the morning he knew it was over. The other Allied commanders thought he was either lying or had lost his mind. The Germans were laughing too. Hitler's surprise attack had just ripped a vast hole through Allied positions in the Ardennes, creating what the press would soon call the Bulge. Wehrmacht commanders were convinced they had accomplished the impossible, total strategic surprise against the overconfident Americans. They believed their winter offensive would sever the Allied armies and force a peace treaty. After all, who could possibly halt 3 German armies, comprised of 250,000 troops and 1,000 tanks, surging through frozen woods toward Antwerp? But the Germans didn't know about George Patton. And they certainly didn't expect that in the coldest winter in recent memory, with temperatures plunging below freezing, this American general would not only halt their charge, but turn their ambitious offensive into their ultimate disaster on the Western Front. This is the account of how Patton's Third Army turned the snow crimson with enemy casualties and transformed Hitler's final gamble into America's most significant battlefield victory. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. was 59 years old when fate called him to the Ardennes. Born into a military lineage in 1885, Patton had dedicated his life to preparing for the moment when everything would depend on one man's capability to guide soldiers into the severity of modern war. By December 1944, he commanded the Third Army, consisting of over 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks, and had already cemented his fame as the most aggressive tank commander in the Allied forces. But December 16, 1944, altered everything. While Patton's Third Army was advancing through the Saar region, preparing for their own thrust into Germany's industrial core, Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. In the pre-dawn darkness, 29 German divisions slammed into the lightly defended American lines in the Ardennes forest. The German strategy was daring in its scope: drive 60 miles through Belgium and Luxembourg, seize the crucial port of Antwerp, and split the British and American forces. What made the German assault so astonishing was not just its scale, but its timing. Allied intelligence had completely failed to spot the enormous concentration of German forces. The Wehrmacht had moved 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks into position, relying only on nighttime movements and strict radio silence. When the attack commenced, it achieved total tactical surprise. Within hours, German armored units were speeding westward, overwhelming American positions and triggering chaos in Allied command centers. The critical moment arrived on December 19th, when General Dwight Eisenhower convened an urgent conference at Verdun. The situation was dire. German forces had already pushed 20 miles into Belgium, imperiling strategic intersections and the vital town of Bastogne. The First Army was in chaos, with entire units fragmented or decimated. If the German drive continued at this velocity, they might actually reach Antwerp and secure their strategic goal. To grasp what transpired next, you must understand the individual who would determine the battle's result. George Patton had been training for this instant his entire military career. As a young officer, he had studied the great military leaders of history, Napoleon, Alexander, Caesar, and believed he was destined to command a great army in a desperate conflict. His early experiences in World War I, where he led the first American tank formations in combat, taught him the crucial strength of armored warfare and rapid offensive maneuvers. Yet Patton's road to the Ardennes was challenging. His spectacular leadership in North Africa and Sicily had been marred by the infamous slapping incidents, where he physically assaulted 2 soldiers suffering from combat stress. This incident nearly ended his career and excluded him from the initial D-Day landings. However, his reputation for energetic leadership and strategic insight made him essential. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general, so much so that he became the centerpiece of a complex deception effort that convinced the Wehrmacht he was planning to invade at Calais instead of Normandy. By the time the Third Army entered France in July 1944, Patton had learned to better manage his aggressive tendencies. His leadership method was unique among Allied commanders. While other generals directed their armies from secure command posts, Patton spent his days visiting frontline units, frequently riding in an open jeep through enemy fire. He recognized that soldiers needed to witness their commander sharing their peril and hardship. The Third Army's swift thrust across France had already showcased Patton's tactical brilliance. After breaking out of Normandy, his troops had advanced 600 miles in just 4 months, freeing thousands of square miles of land and capturing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. But the fall of 1944 brought frustration. Supply shortages and fierce German resistance in places like Metz had slowed his advance to a crawl. Many began to question if Patton was only a successful pursuit commander, effective when chasing a retreating foe, but less capable against determined opposition. The Battle of the Bulge would prove that analysis entirely wrong. What Patton exhibited in the winter of 1944 challenged conventional military wisdom. The idea of impossible logistics becoming achievable through superior leadership and foresight. When Eisenhower asked him how long it would take to turn his Third Army north to counterattack, Patton's response stunned everyone present. While other generals were still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the German offensive, Patton was already several steps ahead. Unknown to the other commanders at Verdun, Patton had already considered this scenario. His intelligence staff had noticed unusual German activity and had drafted 3 separate contingency plans for a northward turn. This was Patton's climax. his brilliance. He didn't just react to events, he anticipated them. While others were taken aback by the German offensive, Patton saw it as a prime opportunity. The sheer scope of Patton's proposal defied traditional military theory. He was offering to pull 6 full divisions out of active combat, turn them 90 degrees, and march them over 100 miles through some of the worst winter weather in decades, all while keeping their combat readiness intact. Most military experts would have labeled this unfeasible. Moving an army while in contact with the enemy is one of the most challenging military maneuvers. Doing it in winter over frozen roads while maintaining secrecy seemed utterly impossible. But Patton understood something that manuals couldn't teach: the force of audacious action to turn desperate situations into decisive victories. His principle was simple: attack, always attack. He believed the enemy was always weaker than they appeared, and that rapid, aggressive action could overcome nearly any disadvantage. This was not thoughtless courage. It was calculated aggression, based on thorough preparation and an intimate understanding of his enemy's limitations. The German strategy had a fundamental flaw that Patton instantly identified. Hitler's plan demanded precise timing and flawless execution. The German forces had limited fuel reserves, only enough for 6 days of operations, and relied on seizing Allied fuel depots to continue their advance. They needed to reach their objectives quickly before Allied air superiority could intervene and before American reinforcements could arrive. Any delay would guarantee the offensive's failure. Patton's solution was simple in concept, but immensely complicated in execution. Instead of attempting to stop the German offensive where it was strongest, he would attack where they were most exposed, at the base of the Bulge. His 3-division assault would not only relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, but also threaten to trap the entire German spearhead. On December 19th, Patton departed the Verdun Conference and immediately set his plan in motion. He contacted his headquarters and spoke just 2 words: play ball. This code phrase activated the pre-arranged operational directives his staff had prepared. Within hours, over 133,000 Third Army vehicles were beginning one of the most complicated military troop movements in history. The 4th Armored Division, the 81st Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division started their march north, followed by support convoys transporting 62,000 tons of supplies. The conditions they faced were beyond brutal. This was the coldest winter in living memory across Europe. Temperatures hovered around -7 degrees Celsius, with snow that made visibility almost impossible. American troops lacked suitable winter attire. Many soldiers had only cotton field jackets and wool overcoats to shield them from the frigid conditions. Weapons seized up and required constant upkeep. Truck engines had to be started every half hour to prevent their oil from thickening. But Patton had prepared for this moment in ways that went beyond mere logistics. He understood that winter combat was as much a battle of morale as it was of supplies. While other commanders took cover in heated headquarters, Patton made it a point to be visible to his troops. He constantly traveled in an open jeep, his only concession to the icy temperatures being a heavy winter parka. His face often froze, but he persisted in his daily inspections, ensuring that the news of his presence spread through the ranks. The psychological effect was colossal. American soldiers fighting in conditions that would have challenged lesser units drew strength from knowing that old blood and guts was enduring their hardship. His words of praise and encouragement rapidly circulated through the Third Army's communication network. The old man says we're the finest soldiers in the world, or Georgie says this is our finest hour. This was not just empty talk. Patton genuinely believed his soldiers were capable of the impossible, and his self-belief became theirs. The German response to Patton's maneuver highlights the true genius of his strategy. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the German 7th Army facing Patton's sector, had expected a rapid reaction from the enemy. He was aware of Patton's reputation for aggressive armored warfare and had even acknowledged that Patton conducted operations according to the fundamental German conception of mobile warfare. But even Brandenberger was astonished by the speed and precision of the Third Army's northward pivot. German commanders had not believed that any Allied force could perform such a complex maneuver under winter conditions. The Wehrmacht's own experiences in Russia had taught them how winter could completely stall even the most effective military machine. They assumed that American forces, with their reputation for reliance on comfort and logistics, would be even more susceptible to winter's effects. This miscalculation reveals a fundamental flaw in German strategic thought by late 1944. They continued to underestimate American military effectiveness, viewing US forces as materially wealthy but deficient in fighting spirit and tactical skill. German General Gunther Blumentritt would later confess, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive tank general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander." But by December 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer the force that had conquered Europe in 1940. The divisions attacking in the Ardennes were a mix of elite formations and hastily assembled units filled with young boys and old men. Many German troops had not eaten in days and lacked adequate winter gear. Their vehicles ran on synthetic fuel that performed poorly in the cold, and their supply routes were already strained past the breaking point. The battle that ensued around Bastogne showcased the transformation of the American army from the novice force that landed in North Africa in 1942 to a seasoned, professional military. The 101st Airborne Division's defense of Bastogne became famous. But it was Patton's relief operation that transformed a defensive hold into an offensive triumph. When German commanders demanded Bastogne's surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became an enduring symbol of American resolve. On December 22, 1944, in the midst of a massive snowstorm, Patton's three-division army attacked. The assault came as a total shock to German forces, who had assumed that winter conditions would prevent any major Allied counteroffensive. Along a 20-mile front, American tanks and infantry crashed into the German flank, pushing 7 miles into enemy positions on the first day. The combat was intense. American forces, driven by Patton's constant demands for aggressive action, refused to yield ground to German counterattacks. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading Patton's advance toward Bastogne, faced some of the finest remaining units in the German army. Tigers and Panthers, the Wehrmacht's most fearsome tanks, fought Shermans and tank destroyers across frozen fields that quickly became scenes of destruction. Patton had instructed his chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, to write a prayer for clear weather that would permit air support. The prayer, distributed throughout the Third Army, asked for divine intervention. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." On December 23rd, the clouds lifted, and Allied fighter bombers descended on German positions like avenging angels. The breakthrough occurred on December 26th, the day after Christmas. Elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, broke through German defenses and linked up with the 101st Airborne in Bastogne. The narrow passage they opened was only 500 yards wide, but it shattered the German encirclement and paved the way for massive reinforcement of the American garrison. But Patton was not satisfied. While other commanders might have been content with relieving Bastogne, he saw the larger picture. The German offensive had dangerously overextended their forces, creating opportunities for devastating counterattacks. "Brad," he told General Bradley, "this time the Kraut stuck his head in the meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." The systematic routing of German forces in the Ardennes took 6 weeks of savage winter combat. American and German soldiers fought in conditions that defy description. Foxholes dug out of frozen earth, weapons that seized up from the cold, men sharing body warmth to avoid freezing to death. The snow, initially untouched white, progressively turned red with the casualties of thousands of soldiers from both armies. By January 16th, 1945, when American forces from north and south met at Houffalize, the Bulge was eliminated. The German offensive, which Hitler had hoped would break the Allied unity, and force a negotiated peace, had instead become a conclusion for the Wehrmacht. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, with over 700 tanks and 1,600 aircraft destroyed. Crucially, Germany had exhausted the last of its strategic reserves in a gamble that utterly failed. Patton's part in this triumph cannot be overstated. His capacity to reposition 6 full divisions in 72 hours while maintaining their combat effectiveness was one of the most extraordinary logistical feats in military history. As he later wrote to his wife, "Destiny sent for me in a hurry when things got tight. Perhaps God saved me for this effort." The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that George Patton was more than just an aggressive armored commander. He was a strategic genius who recognized that audacious action could transform dire circumstances into decisive victories. The Germans, who had scoffed at American military proficiency in December, were no longer laughing in January. They had learned at a terrible price that American soldiers led by commanders like Patton could fight and win under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Winston Churchill, never one to praise American achievements lightly, called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. But for George Patton, it was something more. The vindication of a life dedicated to preparing for the moment when everything would depend on one man's ability to turn an impossible situation into an inevitable victory. The snow had indeed turned crimson, but it was German blood that stained the winter fields of the Ardennes, not American. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge unveiled a fundamental truth about warfare that Patton understood better than any other commander of his generation: that superior leadership, aggressive action, and absolute confidence in one's soldiers could overcome any tactical drawback. The Germans had launched their offensive believing that winter weather and American inexperience would guarantee their success. Instead, they discovered that George Patton's Third Army could fight anywhere, anytime, and against any enemy. The Ardennes became not Hitler's triumph, but his final defeat, and the moment when American forces achieved their finest hour in the crucible of winter warfare.